just on the edge of spring. Lilacs purple, not quite open. Mornings crisp after 10 days of rain. Occidental Park is sun-streaked. Ivy-covered bricks near shelters. Familiar faces, bags of belongings, coats peeled off in a pile. The square is mostly empty, just a few of us coming, going, standing by. Giant chessboard, quiet. Green cafe tables scattered. Two old guys lean against an empty information booth. He's likely in his early 30s, still full of hesitant hope and techno-suspicion. Just days ago, 2 men bombed the finish line of the Boston Marathon, and he can't keep himself from singing. I just want you to know who I am. His voice strains, his face works up to red. Again, I just want you to know who I am. His hands implore the white guy on his cell phone in a square of sunlight, and the black guy stretched out on the steps, and the young woman running under new leaves of maple. When everything's made to be broken, I just want you to know who I am. I don't know how this ends, whether anyone applauds or turns their head or even gets curious. I leave the parking lot on my way somewhere, something I cannot remember. And his voice still ringing, and it's not exactly beautiful. I just want you to know who I am. What I want today is for you to leave here a little more dangerous than when you arrived. And I want to suggest that this is exactly the reason why you need poetry in your life now as a business person. You know, I'm not an expert on climate change. I don't know very much about ISIS. I can't explain the mysteries of the Ferguson shootings or the recent hostage situation in Paris. But what I do know is that all of these complex issues and problems and topics need to be solved by people who are completely and utterly aware of their humanity. When I was younger, I used to believe I had this theory that people should have some particular mandatory services, not like military service, but other services. The first one was I thought everyone should teach high school for a year. I thought everybody should wait tables in a busy urban restaurant. I thought they should sleep for 10 nights on the ground in the wilderness. And I thought they should write poems. Now, I was a 21-year-old high school teacher in a suburb of South Florida where the joke was you didn't compare the teacher's parking lot to the student's parking lot. And this was before The Sopranos, and then TV caught up. And I loved waiting tables because it was fun and it was always moving and I had to juggle all of these tasks and I had to learn to stand on my feet all day and I had to serve the best and the worst of customers. And one time after I had person after person of drunk attendance at the Final Four basketball tournament serving king beers and king cocktails, I chased a table of 10 outside because they stiffed me on their tip. And there's nothing quite like strapping 35, 40, 50 pounds to your back and trekking into the wilderness. It takes about 3 days for your internal psychic Rolodex to go away. You forget what day it is. You have no idea about the politics of late-night television. and your senses become acute, and you notice the pink, sand-washed cliffs and the glow of the northern lights. But now I think, actually, you don't have to do any of those things. You can just write poems. Because if you can write poems, you'd know how to do all the rest. You could strengthen and rekindle and invigorate your humanity. You'd show up in your own voice, no matter how strong or how shaky, and you'd speak out and you'd ask for what you'd want, or you'd speak for those who can't. You'd be better parents, better leaders, better lovers, because poetry makes everything accessible and anything possible. I think you should read it, I think you should write it, I think you should talk about it, and I think you should listen to it. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think that's important as a business person. Because a lot of people, frankly, there aren't very many poets who go in and work with businesses. And I work with large corporations and small businesses and multinational global corporations. I work as a trusted advisor. I speak and do events. And a lot of times people say, poetry? Like, what's that have to do with my bottom line? Shrinking markets, performance, management. What does it have to do with any of those things? And the interesting and important thing to remember is that the bottom line is at the bottom. And all the things that happen before that, all the things that help you determine your success, all the things that differentiate you are about your humanity. You need poetry, not PowerPoint. So I want to tell you a little bit about this. First of all, reading poetry. Reading poetry is not easy, and you might have some bad memories of it. I loved the skit that they did earlier because I love it when people make fun of me. I love it. I think it's great because we do have all of those memories, and I just want to give you my disclaimer right now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you had English teachers that made poetry awful for you. I'm sorry they turned the mystery and magic of it into something that felt like it wasn't for you, or it was too hard, or it was a secret door through which you couldn't go. They meant well. But I think we should move on from that. Here's the thing that I think is so interesting. You know, what would compel you to take time to read poetry? I mean, frankly, as I prepared to write this, I was thinking about, what's a poem that I had to read earlier in my life that was long and rambling and confusing and so on. And so I remembered Wordsworth's Lines Above Tintern Abbey, except for that the real title is Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey on Revisiting the Banks of the Wye During a Tour July 13, 1798. Who has time for that? I mean, it takes you longer to read the title than it does to press buy with one click on Amazon. But here's the thing. When I went to look inside of Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth was writing about a place he visited 5 years prior. And now he had forgotten about it. But he went back to this place, this locale that meant something to him. And all of a sudden, I was then transported, thinking about a place that I hadn't been in a long time and what it meant to me. But most of all, reading poetry is important because it speaks to an exhausted world. Because everywhere you turn, you are encouraged to move faster, quicker, to become disengaged, to become fragmented, and that kind of behavior will not solve the problems that we need to solve in our businesses and in our world. It's counterintuitive to think about slowing down and reading a poem. So I'll just give you a couple of ideas. All right, if you really want to go for it and you really want to dive in, go and actually buy a book of poems, an anthology. I love Garrison Keillor's Good Poems. It's great. It has all these different poems from all different eras and kinds of people. I have random poetry days. I just open it up to any old poem. I read it out loud. I might write about it, or I might not. I might just read it, and that's it. If you can't possibly buy a book, go to poetryfoundation.org, and they have this really cool spinning app. And you can just pick 2 topics. You can pick work and humor, or love and nature, or grief and sports. You can pick any of those things, you click on the button and it spins, and all of a sudden there are 4 or 5, 7 poems that are about those themes or topics. So you could even read about something that you care about. See, here's the thing. What if you read a poem before you left the door in the morning, and you couldn't get this line out of your head, this line that resonated with you all day long, which was this: you must learn one thing. The world was made to be free in. And all day that phrase, that line was running through your head, and you kept searching and looking for places and spaces where you could feel free. And so you went for a walk at lunch. And you came back and you were engaged and focused, and you actually noticed the person sitting across from you at the negotiation table. Or you actually could listen in a different way to your client, so that when that person said to you that they need something, you were paying attention and you said, "Oh, yes, I can do that." Because reading poetry helps you focus and it helps you notice. Now, writing poems is different. Anyone can write poems, anyone. And you don't have to be good at it, and you don't have to ever share it with anyone. Now, I started out writing poems when I was very young, and I have this memory, actually this kind of terrible memory, of leaving a sheath of swampy love poems on the doorstep of my middle school boyfriend. The night before we moved 2,000 miles away. This was like such a bad idea. I never heard from him again. But the point is that inside each of us is the urge to say the unsayable. That's what poetry is. We're trying to say something that can't actually be said. So when you think about that last time that you really wanted to say something that was important to you, maybe it was to someone you love, but maybe it was you were going to make a presentation or a speech or something that you really cared about, something that you had passion around. And all of a sudden it takes this great importance in terms of the language you choose. Well, I can't go out and run a marathon tomorrow if I haven't been training, if I haven't been practicing. And you can't say the things that you really want to say unless you've been practicing with language in a very particular way. So writing poems can help you express yourself in a totally different way. Writing poems can help you come to practice with your own voice. I also think that it's really important to actually talk about poems. Now, this is sort of interesting because if you can imagine, there are a few people who meet me and they think, yeah, we want you to come work with our team, but are you going to make us do stuff with poetry? So there was a really great book that came out a few years ago called What Poetry Brings to Business by Oxford professor Claire Morgan. And Claire Morgan worked with the Boston Consulting Group. Now, those are accountants and consultants. They're not people you would normally think would be wanting to sit around talking about poetry, although that's a myth. Lots of accountants and consultants like to talk about poetry. But let's just say we put all these people together who have to solve really important big problems, and we give them a poem like two that are the most anthologized. Let's say Robert Frost's poem, To Paths Diverged in a Wood, which I actually read here a couple of months ago. Or another one by Northwestern poet William Stafford called Traveling Through the Dark. In both of these poems, the speaker of the poem has to make a really important ethical decision. Do I go this way or this way? The person in Traveling Through the Dark has found a dead deer on the side of the road, and when he approaches it, he realizes the fawn is still alive. Now, this might not be the kind of decision that you have to make in your everyday, ordinary business life, but sometimes it is. And if we actually took time with the people that we work with to talk about something like that, to read the poem and to discuss it and talk about it, this interesting, magical thing happens. We get better at making decisions. We get better at listening to others. We get better at expressing how challenging it is to make those ethical decisions, like laying people off or choosing to invest in something and taking a risk. Because talking about poetry helps us deal with ambiguity. I do a lot of mentoring of entrepreneurs. And I will tell you, most entrepreneurs fail not because they don't have a great idea, not because they're not talented, not because they don't even have enough money. Most of them fail because they can't deal with ambiguity. They don't know where their next paycheck is coming from, and it's too scary. But even if you're not an entrepreneur and you own a business or you're in a business, you will never escape the unknown parts of business. So actually sitting down and talking about something where it isn't all spelled out and we don't have all the answers, that's a practice and that's a discipline. I also think you should listen to poetry. I think you should listen to it because it's pleasurable, because we like it. Because for a few minutes, for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, maybe you were there with me in Pioneer Square watching that homeless man sing the song from the Goo Goo Dolls. It was startling. And I was hurrying. And I was struck by that phrase over and over again, I just want you to know who I am. Because that's all that anybody wants. The people who work with you and the people who you live with. So listening to poetry is ultimately an oral art form. It's meant to be heard. The rise in poetry slams and spoken word has demonstrated to us that we're missing this oral art form of poetry. One of the things I want you to think about and I want you to consider as you look at this year, this January, and making this January a little bit different than any other January, is how might you differentiate it for yourself and for the people you work with? How might you make it different? What sort of risk could you take? A couple of years ago, I was invited to go to speak to a group of leaders for the Seattle colleges, and I went in to meet the chancellor, and I was asking her, what would you like me to talk about? What's important to you? Kind of tell me what's going on. She said, well, tuition is getting ready to rise by 12%, and we're being asked to do more with less. We have more students than we can handle in some programs, and some programs we have to close. I mean, it's like litany of terrible things, right? And at the end of it, she said, and it's raining. It was May. And I went away and I thought about what makes people stay in work they love, even when it's discouraging, even when it feels like they've lost hope. And so I wrote this next and last piece to share with you as a way to help you listen to something, as a sort of a love song to Seattle. Because I think Seattleites are the ultimate in hopeful. I mean, who else says the mountains are out today? Nobody else says that, right? Or that we have more sunglasses per capita than any other city, right? Why I live in this rainy place. Because today, the Cascades are spread out to the east and the Olympics to the west, perfect in the morning sky. Because I'm likely to be stopped still by a blue heron. My morning walk on Alki Beach, the Space Needle spire rising in the distance. Because one morning, 6 a.m. flight, I grab the tired gate agent and I say, look, the rose light illumined Mount Rainier, all 14,000 feet magnified by airport glass just outside on the tarmac. Because for every mile you go west to the Hoh rainforest, you get another inch of rain. Until finally, with reverence, you can walk the moss-covered trails, the cedar-filtered light, verdant, pristine, silent. Because this is the first city I ever loved. And after London, New York, Paris, Sydney, Dublin, San Francisco, I still delight the plane's descent past Adams, Helens, and Rainier. I find my street, my house, and say, this is where I live. Because I tell Starbucks baristas in faraway towns that I live near the mothership. As if this will make a difference. As if they'll treat my coffee with more respect. Because if it's true that we have 300 days of gray, then those 65 are perfect in their expansiveness, optimism, and hope. Who needs San Diego when here the weather reminds us that change is indeed inevitable and our days to come are filled with sun?